Hey, Project Zion Podcast listeners. This is Blake Smith, Project Manager for Project Zion Podcast. As we all know, the Community of Christ just completed an historic world conference where our first female president prophet was sustained and ordained. For this episode of Coffee Buzz, we've once again connected with Ministry for Dummies host Jacob Ross and Humberto Tinsman to cross-post their conversation with then President Prophet Designate Stassi Cramm. We're grateful for their willingness to share this episode with you, our listeners, and we hope you enjoy. Now, in the words of President Cramm, onward.
Welcome to Ministry for Dummies, a Community of Christ podcast hosted by the Community of Christ Southern USA Mission Field. All are welcomed here, and the stories and opinions that are shared here are part of our story and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Community of Christ.
Well, it may in this case actually reflect the official position of the Community of Christ. As Humberto and I have teased for, I don't know, I guess it's been a month. We are so honored to have our third guest, President Prophet Designate Stassi Cramm. Welcome to the podcast, Stassi.
Thanks, guys. It's really good to be here with you and your listeners tonight.
You know, the five of us, that is our listeners, are all very excited to hear this interview. I mean,
especially our moms.
Especially our moms, our dads, and
my parents too. So I totally get it.
Parents, 6.
Awesome.
We're up to 6 today.
Oh, look at us.
Look at us go. So we're up to 6. But yeah, Bert, unless you want to, if anything specific, we'll just dive right into the questions we received.
Yeah, let's just do it. So before we dive right in, we also just want to give a shout out to all of the listeners who submitted questions and comments for this interview. Again, Jake and I are lazy and we don't like writing our own episodes, so thank you for doing it for us.
That is very true.
But we are just so appreciative of this community coming together and for this time where we can just spend. So yeah, let's just dive right in.
Yeah, I guess, now that you mentioned that, I will say we did our best. We had several questions that were our merged questions that we got, so we tried to do our best to combine them and then make them fair, even questions. So hopefully nobody gets too offended on how we, junked questions together. But we'll start off with our first question. What is a favorite camp memory of yours?
Wow. So that's hard, not because of how old I am, which might be an assumption, but because, as you can imagine, I have been to a lot of camps and reunions. And I just have so many interesting memories of fun times, of spirit-filled times, of community, just fabulous stuff. So how about if I focus on a particular situation that happened a long time ago, but that just kind of like dinosaur bones, we were having a conversation and sort of excavated and discovered this connection. So a long time ago, I was at a camp in Central Illinois. And although this probably sounds weird in this day and age, back in those days, hunting was big in the area where this reunion campground was. And one year, one of the activities for the campers was actually target shooting. Again, I know that sounds a little bit strange in our current era, but one of our members was a representative for Smith & Wesson. And so he was an expert and had, brought some guns. And I remembered that there was this one particular gun that was really special and that was used for safaris. And I remember him talking about how unique it was. So we were talking about camp memories one time, and I was partnered with, at the time, President of 70, John White. And I was telling him about this memory because I knew that he and his family had spent time at this same campground. And we were kind of laughing about how strange it was that you would do target shooting at a camping experience. And he looked like really perplexed. And I was like, what's wrong? How come you look so strange? And he was like, because I was there. And I was like, what do you mean you were there? He goes, no, he goes, I remember the Smith and Wesson representative. I remember the special gun. And he said, and that only happened one time. And so I was like, are you sure? He's like, no, I'm absolutely positive. And so we spent a bunch of time, again, sort of excavating and looking for all the clues. And we figured out that it occurred when I was 6. And I wasn't really a camper. I was at the camp with my parents, and he was 16, and he was attending the camp as a camper. And so through that exploration, which is kind of a strange story, but it really reminded me, and actually both of us, of how interwoven our relationships are that get created at camp. And sometimes we don't even realize where we're making connections or where we have common experiences until like years later when things start to bubble up. So I love the idea of how our camping program weaves our lives and our life stories together.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings, right, whenever people are talking, it's like, oh, such and such, it's such a small world. I'm like, well, it's really not. You're just in a really small church. So, that's what makes it so small, because there are just random, obscure intersections. Exactly like that.
Yeah.
I love that. Small but mighty, definitely.
That's
It's
right.
small but very connected. Speaking of connections, there is often a debate that goes off of what is the best way to start your morning. And I would ask this. So, Stacey, for you, are you a coffee person or of a tea person in your day-to-day?
Yeah, I'm absolutely a coffee person, although I will drink tea. So I never turn down, tea. But if I am left to my own, I always drink coffee. I love both hot coffee in the morning. I like cold coffee on a summer afternoon. But in the last like 12 years or so, I really only drink decaf because I drink so much coffee and I'm relatively wired anyway. So you put me on caffeine and it's a little bit too much for the whole world.
I love it. No, I love it. A previous story that we shared on this podcast was the time that our coffee maker broke in the middle of a reunion. And I've said that is the fastest I've ever seen a donation be collected and a goal achieved in a reunion experience. So yes, we
Amen
know
to that. Well, and
exactly.
decaf is not always present. So I run around with little Starbucks decaf Vias just in case, because you can always find hot water.
I love it.
I'm more of a tea person. I'm not really actually even a caffeine person. I wake up every morning at 6 and just go for a walk. And then I save my caffeine for when I'm, really dragging. But I'm like
See, I also used to be that way. And then a lovely person named Zach Harmon McLaughlin in the seminary program happened. And now we are here where we are. But
it happens.
We love you, Zach. No. Coffee is. I see. I love the ritual of. So I grind my own beans and I make it for Emily and
You're
I,
a
and we do a
snob.
drip.
Yeah, we get it.
And I'm just saying, I love it. It's part of my routine. So okay, moving on. We can't talk about coffee all the time.
But I do like the walking part. So I just want to do a shout out for
thank
Jacob
you.
for walking. I'm committed to 12,000 steps and 6 miles a day. So I'm a huge walker too.
It's nice.
Wow, awesome.
It's a good routine. Although it's harder in the summer in Houston because it's so gosh darn hot.
Yeah, amen.
Our next question is a little bit deeper and definitely broad. What is a significant thing you've changed your mind on, whether from personal conversations or experiences, scholarly discussions or debates, or your own studies?
Ooh, changed my mind on. Well, I can't really think of a situation where I've done like a total 180, in a moment kind of thing. But I definitely can think of situations where over time, as I've grown into a deeper understanding and appreciation on certain topics, that if you were to picture me on a spectrum, that where I stood on a spectrum has definitely changed and deepened. And I would say, changed and deepened into a space of understanding and appreciation. So like if I were to really be pressed, I can think of like maybe 4 social topics that through like the last 20 to 30 years, I've gone from probably a relatively simplistic viewpoint, I guess is what I would say, to a more complex understanding. And those 4 topics would be human sexuality, privilege and prejudice, resolving differences. In other words, violence, nonviolence, conflict, everything from difficult conversations to difficult national debates, and earth stewardship and our connectedness and need to care for the world and all of creation. And actually, I wouldn't limit it to the world, because obviously we're part of a massive universe of universes, and it's really all of that, because I really see the connectedness in all of that.
Awesome. That's just great to hear. So a similar question, as you are discerning and as you are, looking at these different topics, both in your role, but also just, as a disciple and a human being, what are those influences that of your worldview, and how does that change? And, what are those kind of pillars in your life that you use?
Yeah, so some of your listeners may know, but not everybody. I was trained as an engineer. So my undergraduate degree was in engineering. And before I went to work full-time for the church, that's what I did. So it pretty much goes without saying that for an engineer, data is really important. And the whole idea of trust but verify related to data is really important. Yet at the same time, even in my engineering career, one of the things that I would bring into the teams is that, unlike some of my peers and colleagues, I'm also very intuitive. So I have just kind of this sense about listening and observing, and not just the quantitative data, but also kind of that qualitative that leads to perspectives. And I think that really influences my worldview. I've also come to understand that the privilege of my birth, that I'm able to have certain perspectives simply out of the privilege of my birth, or the educational opportunities that I've had, or where I've had the opportunity to live. I feel like my family and my friend relationships, that all influences me. I've had a host of experiences through my life, and I've been able to travel around the world, and all of that has shaped me. Both my own economic status, but witnessing the economic status of others. And golly, the list just kind of really goes on and on. I think that what I've come to understand, and again, back to education, my PhD is in leadership. And so one of the things that I've really come to understand is that as a leader, that the challenge that I have is to try to observe not only the world, but the church and the role of leadership, not only from my own shoes, but to spend time trying to understand the world from other people's perspectives. And sometimes that's easy. So sometimes it's really easy to like lay down your own perspective and say, oh yeah, I can see where this person's coming from. Other times it can be really, really hard. And so one of the things that I've really come to appreciate, especially as it relates to moving past my own worldview in the process of discernment, is the 6 lenses for discovering God's will that the church teaches about. So for those that haven't been to seminary like Humberto, or haven't read some of the church's resources, those 6 lenses are knowledge and reason, experience, scripture, history or tradition, continuing revelation, and common consent. And I know of these 6 that there's some that I favor more than others. But knowing all 6 of them sort of holds me accountable to say, okay, what am I really strongly using and what am I missing? So they remind me that I cannot always rely on just limited ways of viewing the world that I feel most comfortable with, and that I have to always be willing to expand my horizons, to stretch, especially to listen to voices that are different than mine, to help open myself to new ways of understanding.
See, kids from Cianito, I'm not the only one who's talking about those 6 lenses. They're important. They're important. Dang it.
They are. I mean, I've never been to seminary, so those are new to me. I guess I consider myself averagely read in church resources, so it's always
Jacob,
good.
Well, they
I
show
have-
up
I
here
have-
and again. If you Google it on the church's website, you will get some articles and stuff about it. So they're important, and I really do find that they're helpful. As you can imagine, I already said I favor data, so knowledge is one of my biggies. But really seeking out that balance with experience and scripture and tradition and every continued revelation, and then that common consent is the community part. So they're all really important.
Yeah, they absolutely are. All right, now this one we received multiple questions on, which of course we totally expected. So this is on the sale of the church historic sites. So we did try and roll this one up. So for everybody who submitted questions, here's what we got. What do you plan to do to rebuild trust with those whose relationship with the World Church has been harmed by the sale of the historic sites and how it was handled and shared?
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that question. I'm also not surprised, to hear that there were multiple ways of asking this question. It's, clearly how you've rolled it together. It's an insightful and very multifaceted question. It also leads me to ask, you and your listeners another question, which is how would you rebuild trust if someone told you they no longer trusted you because of a decision you made, even though you believe the decision you made was the right decision? So the answer is more straightforward, I think, when broken trust is based on a mistake that was made. It gets more complex when broken trust is based on disagreement over a decision that was made or disagreement over how the decision was made. So I'm going to break this into 3 different scenarios so that we can explore it in a little bit of depth and try to not overly simplify it. So let's look at one scenario. If someone has lost trust in leadership because of the sale, because they think that selling historic assets was a bad decision, then that's, I think, one scenario we can talk about. And of course, in that case, as people would have read in all the material that was released, leadership acknowledges this perspective. We understand this perspective, but we do not necessarily share this perspective. So in this regard, leadership can't apologize for the decision, since we believe that we did the very best that we could do in faithfully listening, to God and fulfilling our responsibility as leaders. However, we can work and will work and are trying to work towards a mutual understanding that everyone, all of us, are committed to the church's mission. So those that disagree with us, we're not questioning that they're committed to the church's mission, but we're also then asking that they understand that we are also committed to the church's mission. And if we can find space there, then that gives us common ground to build on. And also the principles of faithful disagreement, which you can find on the church's website or on our ministry tools, they guide us in pursuing our mission together, even though we have this significant disagreement. So that's kind of one scenario. Another scenario might be for those who have lost trust from a belief that leadership should have consulted with the World Conference, because we've definitely heard, that perspective. And we've tried really hard to explain why the decision was made the way it was. Leaders, myself included, are really dedicated to collaborative decision-making on important matters whenever possible. But as we've tried to explain in a lot of the Q&As and other material, it just was not feasible in this particular situation. I understand that once again, some people disagree with this conclusion because almost every decision is debatable. And that has led to this sense of not trusting that leaders want to be collaborative. So I am sorry, and I do feel bad that people feel that way. I'm hopeful that as we continue to journey together, that other ongoing collaborative efforts, like the work that we're doing on the statement of nonviolence, will continue to demonstrate leadership's commitment to collaborative decision-making whenever possible and appropriate. So let's try one more scenario. So a third scenario is if trust has been lost due to frustration about the situation or anger about the church's financial challenges, then that creates some other feelings that we have definitely heard about. Leaders, as we have shared, prayerfully struggled with difficult and complex questions about how to support the church's mission given our current realities. We've communicated, at least we feel like from our perspective, the church's significant financial challenges through various updates, including financial updates and the way forward messages from the presidency. At the same time, we have also heard that people didn't understand that communication or didn't see it and didn't feel like we, adequately made the information known. So that's a critique that we have received and, taken as a lessons learned. Eventually in our journey, it became clear that selling some historic sites was the only viable solution. We understood that this decision would sadden many in the church because, we were heartbroken by it ourselves. However, we tried to help the church understand through ongoing communications that leaders are passionate about and committed to both the church's mission, the church's history, and our theocratic democracy in all of its missions for decision-making. So it is the church's mission that matters most to us and hopefully to everyone, and that will, continues to drive all our decisions. So to come back to how do we rebuild trust, as we move forward, I trust that the Holy Spirit will continue to guide and unite us as we focus on our common mission. During difficult times, it's really easy to become frustrated and damage the integrity of our community. My dad was a coach, so an analogy that I would lift up is a sports team that tends to make more mistakes and kind of turn on each other when they're not playing well, and that just further impacts their ability, to play well and hopefully succeed. The other thing that I would say that at least in the USA context, my observations, and perhaps you have different observations, but I feel like we live in a culture right now that is prone towards cynicism and division.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So you share that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
So in that, that's the outside culture. So I'm really committed, and I trust that your listeners and both of you, and I know other World Church leaders are committed to create a different kind of culture in the church. We want to create a culture that seeks to trust that we are deeply grounded in our common love for each other, for the church, and for its mission. If we can ground ourselves in that common space, then when difficulties arise, I hope we can start with the assumption that we are all acting in the best interest of the church and its mission. So this shifts the focus from a one-way question of accusation to a shared question of exploration, where together we can seek greater understanding. Now, I realize this does not eliminate disagreements, or it doesn't eliminate the need for difficult questions or accountability of decisions that are made. But it does give us a starting place for conversation that's different than what we really experience in the world around us. So trusting in our common motives, which leads us to the opportunity to learn together in ways that strengthens our community, is a way of being that I hope we can continue to embrace. So my prayer is, I know that we're going to face more challenges in the days ahead. not because of anything that we are necessarily doing or not doing, but because we live in a complicated, messy world. But in the midst of those challenging days, I think there are going to be a whole host of opportunities for us to be the bearers of good news, for us to shed the light of Christ into the world and to share Christ's peace. So I hope we can focus on our common mission and trust each other's motives. I think is a great way of getting started. And so I realize, that we've got work to do, but I hope we can rally together because, we still have a lot of opportunities ahead of us that we need to face together.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me with this topic in particular, I think an analogy I've come to is it felt like a car accident where every time you drive on the road, like it felt like it was a footnote in conversations in the past. Like, we're looking at, it's not off the table to sell church property. And it was there and it was in footnotes, kind of like the inherent risk when you drive a car. Like, some idiot can T-bone you at any moment. But then it just kind of happened. And like when you lose someone in a car accident, you didn't know it was happening. You didn't know, the last time you say goodbye, the last time you see them. And I think, for me personally, a lot of my frustration was in the fact that I felt like I didn't see it coming and I felt like I didn't have that closure, like when somebody's going to pass. I've read relatives in hospice care, for example, someone's going to pass, you have that opportunity for closure. And I felt like in this instance, it didn't get to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, or at least it didn't get to happen in the way you might have wanted it to happen. So
yeah.
I hope that, we can find other ways maybe to get to some of that closure. And I know we've been working with the Historic Sites Foundation, they're looking at creating some opportunities. I know there was just recently a retreat, for instance, at Kirtland that was sponsored by Community of Christ. So we're still hoping to be able to create some of those opportunities, fully acknowledging that for many that will not feel the same as if we had done it before the sale. But as we've said in a lot of our publications, if we were going to have to do it, we needed to have the strongest negotiating position that we could have to optimize the outcome for the benefit of Community of Christ. And those were the trade-offs, and it was tough. It's not a journey that I would wish on any leaders ever.
And hopefully we don't have to. Of course, I say that. I don't. Well, no, I won't. I won't open that bag of worms. But yes, I hope. Hopefully, not opening Pandora's box. But yes.
Yeah,
that's
I know that we can probably spend all night on this topic, and I want to move us away from it. But I just wanted us to pause, and I just want to offer my gratitude to you. Because this is a difficult question. This is a hard question that many of us are still processing, like Jacob talked about, like a death, like any loss. It takes time to process and to grieve. And I just appreciate your openness and letting us ask that question and, recognizing, it's something that a lot of us are still discerning and deciphering. But like you, and as Jacob and I, we've discussed, we hope that as we continue to discern, the passion will turn from a place of either loss or grief into a passion of, okay, this is where we are now. How do we continue to share our sacred story? And how can we then, as members, recognize that if we truly value those items or those historical assets, maybe we should start asking ourselves, how are we supporting them? Are we supporting them to our truest capabilities? And, what can we be doing in the future to, make sure that our sacred story is still something that we put on our front and center. So thank you again for your openness.
Well, and again, not to be like the forecaster of gloom and doom, but the presiding bishopric has told us, that the income that will be generated from these really stabilize us for the next 5 or so years. but we have to find how to increase contributions to the church if we want to continue to maintain the size of ministries and services that we're currently providing. So, so the small print or the footnotes are in the financial updates. Again, the good news is we've got this period of time. And so we really all need to be working together to say, what really matters most with regards to mission, and how are we going to financially support it together?
So I have a follow-up question to that. And maybe you can explain this to me like I'm an idiot, but I mean, the number is like 290 million and right? It's something like that.
100. Well, the sale was like 191 million,
okay,
with 175 going into endowments.
So that went to like refill the temple endowment that was drained, or it's just in general funds?
Yeah, it's going to the worldwide mission endowment and also to the temple endowment. The temple endowment has recovered from some of its earlier stages, but was never that big. So this makes the temple endowment a larger amount than it's ever been. And the intent then is that using a conservative spending rate, it will allow the temple endowment to continue to grow, so that as inflation occurs and the cost of supporting not only the operations of the physical plant, but also the ministries of the temple, which are funded by the endowment, that there will always be enough in there to support that. And then that allows us to then focus on worldwide mission and how to grow that endowment, but also then how to grow just annual contributions that are wanting to support worldwide mission.
Yeah. So I guess I was surprised that amount, the returns on that would not be significant enough to fund, because I mean I'm not like a savant, but I mean like a 7% return rate on an investment account like that I felt was reasonable, and I was thinking like, well, our operating budget in my head was like aligned with how much we would be making on a return on an account like that. So when I saw that, alarm bells went off. I mean, Berto and I discussed this at one point, I think.
Well, I know you don't want to do like, Excel 101. So, but just for the sake of like naming a few things. So 7% would be the average long-term return, but inflation for the church is, in some of the countries where we work, is anywhere from 30 to 50%. In other places, it's 10 to 20%. So what you're trying to do in an endowment is typically maintain purchasing power, which says you have to take your average return. You have to figure out how much of it you have to reinvest so that it will grow to cover inflation. And what's left over is what you can spend. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole set of spreadsheets that the presiding bishopric has where they've been looking at inflation rates around the world and how much needs to be put back in each year so that they can continue to fund the level of ministries and services of that 175 million that it's supporting.
Yeah. I mean, that I trust that they're looking at that kind of thing. It was just like weird. Off-putting. That's the word I'm looking for. It was off-putting when that one came across the ticker.
Yeah. Well, it's complicated. It's just like if you lose money, like if you have money invested in the market, and you lose money, it takes a lot longer to gain it back than it, does to lose it, just because of the nature of interest and how that works. And then the nature of inflation and other impacts on the value of a dollar.
Yeah. The house always wins.
The house always wins.
Are you done talking about money now, Jacob? Can we talk about that stuff?
Talking about money.
I feel like he's like a bishop. We have like a bishop in the making. I'm feeling like the need to, pull up some spreadsheets.
No, that's perfectly all right. That's my day job.
We can have Ron Harmon come back and do a whole, endowment for dummies kind of episode.
Now, that may not actually be a bad idea, but
That actually, if you can put in a good word, hey, we'll take all the guests.
Absolutely. He would be happy to do that.
I love it. Okay, let's breathe. Thank you again. Those were hard topics, but I think good ones that I think many are who like me are not spreadsheet savants, but are passionate about learning as much as we can. Very appreciative of that conversation. So closely related, but kind of changing gears a little bit. Jacob and I are in a demographic that often the church talks about as being a key for future success in the community of Christ, so that 20 to 30 age range. What are some of your plans that you're working on right now or discerning on to engage with young adults in the United States, and then looking, always further out in an international context as well?
Yeah, for sure. So, I love to answer a question with questions. Maybe that's the old teacher in me, but I want to just pose a couple of questions for your listeners. And then if they have any responses, they can email me. And so I'll just say my email is easy to remember. It's Scram, or SCRA and then 2 M's at seaofchrist.org. So here's a couple of questions
I'm hitting out
in
the
response.
sad trombone.
Yeah, we do not really want your listeners to scram, just to email Scram.
Yeah. All right.
So here's my questions. First of all, how do young adults in the USA and across the world want to be engaged by the president? Because I can have all these great ideas, but if it does not align with how young adults are wanting to be engaged, then my strategies won't work very well. And related to that then is, what support do they feel like they need to live Christ's mission? And what activities or events or resources would they value and purchase or make time to participate in? So if anybody has ideas, again, I would invite them to email me. Having said that, though, of course, as I prepare for my new role, I am continuing to focus primarily right now on leadership changes within the leading quorums of the church. And so there's a lot of really intentional discernment process going on. And later this year, I will share with the church kind of where my discernment is taking me, so that the church can reflect and discern on those possible calls should my call be approved. And right now I'm getting, inputs from a lot of different people and different perspectives. And that input includes, how do we engage different demographics and different backgrounds and diversity. So in all of that, one of the things that really has bubbled out is that we need a first presidency that can inspire vision and encourage the church to use its collective prophetic imagination. And in this case, the church is all ages, all countries, all members and friends. So we've got to be able to share and inspire in that realm. And similarly, the Council of 12 is going to need to be able to develop mission strategies that speak to that same worldwide church and that can be implemented through the multi-nation and USA teams of apostles. And so that really leads to another question, and that is, how do young adults want to be a part of the church's vision and mission, both developing it and living it out? And what will compel you and your listeners to participate? And what's the best way for us to achieve that? So the only way I know is to keep asking questions and inviting involvement, both directly when we're together in person, indirectly through podcasts like this, and through ongoing surveys and other means. And then we're going to have to probably experiment our way into the future, because based on all the surveys that we have done, there's no pony in the pile. There's just a wide level of perspectives and ideas. And so we're just going to have to feel our way kind of into the future. So in this moment, I'm really at the front end, and I don't want to make any promises that I can't keep. So my answer may seem kind of simplistic at this point, but I hope that there will be opportunities created after the 2025 World Conference, and maybe even during it. I know at the last World Conference, there was an evening where Chandra and I had the opportunity to sit with a group of young adults who were at conference. And so if there's some of you that want to organize one of those opportunities during the next World Conference, I will support that, and we will find a time, when I can be there. So I hope that your listeners will take advantage of having my email, and that they will share what is important to them and how they would like to see things happening. And I commit to listening and trying to integrate and try to find ways to experiment as we move together.
Yeah, when this came across, it was framed in also talking about the young adult survey that happened, I guess, a couple years ago now. There's a whole bunch of hype behind it, and then it kind of went nowhere. And maybe this was just I kind of laughed when I saw the results, because I saw there were people who answered who were over 50. And I think that's just so endemic of the church is like, even if you're no longer a young adult, you may still be a young adult relative to the congregation in which you worship every day, right? And my mom has this great story where she talks about a summer she was leading a young adult class reunion, and one of the young ladies in the class, her mom came to the class, and she was like, she couldn't believe it, like the lack of self-awareness to like think you're a young adult and then you pollute data. So I don't know if that's related at all to what happened there, but I felt like there was so much and then it just kind of fizzled. At least front facing.
And we asked people's age so that we can sort, so that you can partition your data. The problem that we had is once we partitioned to really seeking, well, what was the strong feedback from young adults? Even that was not strong. They were kind of all over the space. I think something that I should mention, we were talking about the presiding bishopric, but they just hired 2 new positions based on the generosity of a contributor who's very interested in how we engage. Now, in this case, it's under 65, but they've broken it into 2 groups. And I don't remember exactly how the bishopric is doing it, but it's like 65 down to like a point, maybe like 45 or 40. And then it's like 40 to 18 or something like that. So I'm hoping to see some really good engagement and exploration happening out of those 2 focused positions, at least with regards to what matters most in mission and what people feel really passionate about, and how they are, their ideas for how do we financially support things.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is another...
I realized we talked too much about finances. We should have, like I said, we should have really vetted these questions better. I am so sorry. But hey, this is what we got.
Well, they're all relevant in light of things. Yes. We're not jumping topics, so that's better. At least we had the foresight to sort them appropriately. As you're talking about, this really bleeds well with what you're saying. What do you see as the future of funding and how local congregations may use their buildings to generate income instead of a quote unquote sell first mindset?
Yeah. No, I think that's important. So I do find it interesting that the question assumes there is a sell first mindset. So I do want to say that in my experience, that is often the last strategy that's considered. And I can actually give you a multitude of examples where in some cases groups waited so long and deferred maintenance had been so deferred that they actually lost value in their sale because they waited too long. But there have been instances where a group had a clear vision for their mission and quickly concluded that their building was holding them back. And so in those cases, they did move pretty quickly. I think what's important in this question is, is how do our buildings serve as a tool for mission? And if we're not using our buildings to their full capacity, then what is our stewardship for looking for alternative ways to use those buildings? And those are great questions, and every group that's associated with a building should be, really asking that, not just like once in a while, but all the time. But I do want to acknowledge that that is a complex challenge, especially in the US, but also in other countries. But it's easier for me to right now talk about the US because of tax statutes. In most, if not all of our states, church properties receive tax breaks because they support religious activities and they don't compete with for-profit businesses. So if you rent out your property for other purposes, depending on what you do with it, it can change your tax status, which is fine as long as the additional income that you're generating covers any extra expenses that you're having. I think what's really important is that people commit to being really creative. Again, considering how their building is a tool for both disciple formation, for community formation, but also for, mission out into the community, and that they evaluate all the possible options. They need to be really honest about the building's condition, because a lot of our buildings are really old and they were built in an era for kind of different ways of being together, and they're not necessarily configured for modern use. Some of our buildings lack accessibility for people, who maybe can't climb stairs, which even, that can be a problem even for people that have temporary situations. Some of our buildings have asbestos or other environmental challenges. So I think the clue is, again, how do our buildings serve as a tool for mission? How do we honestly assess what the options are for using the building? If we're not going to fully use it, are there other alternatives that can be explored to generate additional income? Creating a solid plan for how all of that's going to be worked out, and making sure that you're considering all the local laws and statutes and the risk and all those other kinds of things. So discernment is definitely about listening to the leadings of the Spirit, but discernment is also about doing the hard work of collecting the data and considering all of the options based on the information.
I'm waiting for Jacob, our budding bishop, to
Oh, I
cut
didn't
in.
realize you were. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all those points, right? I think in a lot of cases, I think of like the church I grew up in. It's like a 2.5 story old building with an addition that's also old, and none of the basement is at street level. The sanctuary is not. Multiple steps, stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, of course, our
the other
congregation in
thing, and
Houston
this,
is-
I talked about cynicism, so I don't want this to come across like cynically. But the other thing is, our congregational buildings are not our attics or our basements or our backyard sheds. So if you're attending a congregation, enter it with like new eyes and see what you see. And if you see like old furniture that you won't sit on, then perhaps that old furniture shouldn't be in there. Or if you see boxes of stuff that no one knows what's in it, or you open a closet door and everything falls out, that's another part of being good building stewards, is how do we shape up our buildings to be like fresh and clean and inviting. So
Usable.
sorry, just a little pet peeve. And,
That's
okay, to risk being
you are
completely
amongst
irreverent.
friends.
Can that be your first section of your addition to the Doctrine and Covenants? Can we just make that? Hey,
Let's
the
just
church
put
is
it in the
not
church
your attic.
policy.
The church is not. Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
My okay, quick segue. One of my first year here at the Albuquerque branch, I cleaned out the church library because they had books like the Nixon Papers and Beach Body Workout 101, and just and again, we understand it when people pass away and they were great stewards of the church. All of their belongings should go to the church, but there's limits, folks. So yes, yeah.
Yeah, we've had that issue, and one of the perks of our current congregational building, and I mean, we're looking at is making our space more available for other groups to use. Not other. In the past, we've had another congregation who did services, and then that comes out like people are competing for time and for space, and there's people on Sundays you intersect and all conflict there. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to be self-aware of what you're dealing with, and even though you enjoy that space and you love using that space, it does not mean that an outside group is going to come in and go, oh man, I can't wait to pay X dollars an hour to be here.
Yeah,
exactly. You're nailing it.
And I think, kind of the heart of this question, like many of the questions, it is broad because every building comes with its own challenges. Every building needs to be looked at as its own, in that, unfortunately, there isn't a really good one-size-fits-all model, because... And I should say also, I'm glad that you said it should be a constant question, because it is. My first year in the Albuquerque branch, no, I would say we don't have a use for our building because we only use it on Sundays. Now, because of successes of outreach programs like scouting and different community programs, yes, our building matters now because it's not just being used on Sundays. So, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's a continuous conversation.
What was that line Larry had? It was our buildings should be a place for community, not just worship, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Our building should be a place for community, not just worship. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. So I'm going to skip down a little bit because we've talked a lot about, your plans and times for questioning. So I'm going to move to, again, a very broad question. So I apologize. But in your mind, what is the future of groups that might not be what some would think as traditional groups in the community of Christ, meaning groups like the LGBTQ plus community, the LDS seeker community, other converts or other people of color, Latin American, obviously very biased, but other peoples of colors in the church? What do you see as their continuing role or voice as the church continues to grow in those areas?
Yeah, so, again, very broad question. I think if the question is, do I believe that Community of Christ is called to be an inviting, inclusive, accepting community, then my answer is emphatically like, yes, 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 yes. If the question is whether I believe Community of Christ is fully living into this calling, then my answer is unfortunately not yet, or not fully. We have significant room for growth as we continue to be shaped and guided by the Spirit. And the nature of that growth really depends on where you are attending church, what country you're in, what part of that country you're in. In our best of moments, we hope that our church culture influences our citizenship in our national culture. But often what happens is our national culture influences our behavior within our church culture. And so that's the role of repentance and forgiveness, and so we're a work in process. But the vision is as strong and compelling as it has ever been, And I think that we're really guided by the work that was done some time ago, and that appears like in the sharing and community of Christ. We are one, we are many. And those words, which were written out of an international leaders meeting, are so powerful even today, and just really give us a vision for the unity that we are called to create, and the diversity that we are challenged to celebrate and to fully embrace. So I feel like that we're in this space where we must continually repent for any past prejudices. um, one of the topics from World Conference, one of the resolutions that got referred to the First Presidency, was about Section 116 and the Doctrine and Covenants. And in the coming months, you're going to be seeing some information about that. And in consultation with people of color and with the diversity and inclusion team and the church and history and sacred story team, we have decided, President Veazey in particular, but collectively the First Presidency, that Section 116 will remain in the Doctrine and Covenants because no one felt like it should be removed. That was considered to be, an act of denying our past. But we're adding a new preface to it to put it in context, and we're making an editorial change based on some notes and stuff that we found, which will create a slightly different paragraph break that we think is more representative of the original intent. So that's just an action that from a section that was added to the Doctrine and Covenants a long time ago, but we're continuing to be open to, how we should be handling it in, the current day. So your listeners can watch for those announcements on social media and stuff. But having said all this, I get that inclusion is really difficult, and that the path is not easy, and that it leads to really difficult conversations because individuals disagree on the most faithful way forward. And back to my earlier comment on trust, we have to start with the common ground that we are all motivated to faithfully live Christ's mission, and that whatever stance we are taking, we're doing that because we are trying to be faithful. But we're just going to have to keep working together and keep centering ourselves on what does God's unconditional love for all people look like? And then how do we embrace that and live that, and yet still hold ourselves accountable for being faithful individuals and a faithful community. So these are really essential conversations for us. And we want to be the signal community for the rest of the world. We want to stand out as being those people who truly practice God's unconditional love for all people. And so we must have the courage to continue as we strive to become the community that I think God is really calling us to be.
And I think that's such an important point, right? Because we touched on this in an earlier comment at some point, talking about cynicism and division. And, there is that disconnect, in my opinion, sometimes between people who identify as Christians and then their willingness to love all of God's children. And I think it's important to prioritize, well, this is kind of what Jesus' whole thing was. And there's value in making sure you're following what he taught and not what other people who taught you, and maybe in Sunday school, for example, think personally based off their own prejudices and personal beliefs. So that's
I just want to say, as a person of color who has experienced racism within the church, with outside the walls of the church, and working with others, social justice is never a fast process, and nor should it be. But the thing that I tell folks, as you have shared, is to not lose hope, that there is process, there is ways forward. And I think as we continue to have these important and often very vulnerable conversations on all sides of the spectrum, I do see the calling of Community of Christ, of coming together and recognizing that these are not things that can be wished away in a week conference. These are not things that should be wished away in a vote, that it takes a lot of soul searching, of discussion, of hard conversations, and times where we need to leave the table because we just cannot agree of where we are. So, yeah, that was really cool to hear some of that news. Look at that.
Yeah.
Ministry for Dummies
Breaking
on the
news.
forefront of church news, folks. Come on
That's
now.
As
right.
we often say, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the questions I told the Quorum of High Priests just recently, they were having an online gathering together, and I was sharing with them. And, there's no question that some of these feel like overwhelming. And, and some of these topics, people are just like, oh, this is too contentious. I just want to walk away from it. It's just too much. So the question that is really driving me forward as I think about stepping into this new role is, there's 100,000 different reasons why I would turn and run and say, never mind, I'm not going to go just disappear. But what keeps driving me forward is the question, what if we get it right?
Yeah.
I think if we really trust in that continuing, revealing God that we've all experienced in different ways, there's lots of topics that are really tough and overwhelming and that we may have to work really hard at. But if we cling together and we keep leaning into the future and we keep listening and we keep trying and we keep experimenting, what if we get it right? Hallelujah. We will in fact be a transformative presence in the world. And back, to what Jesus said, it's about yeast and salt. We don't have to be the dominant, large, consuming, overtaking community. We can be the small, impactful community that's transforming the world. And that's what I'm looking for.
Amen. 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 I love it. We have two final questions for you. So
Okay.
just thank you for all the time that you
we
spent
made
with
it.
us.
We're officially past the 1 hour mark.
We're almost there.
You guys are gonna have a lot of cutting to do.
No. This has all been great.
That's too much work. We're just gonna
we're gonna
trim the front and trim the back, and we're gonna
we don't have an edit budget. Anyways,
just put it on triple speed and get through it.
That's
There you
right.
go.
Yeah,
There you
power
go.
through.
So we've bypassed this, but I think we should ask it because it's crucial to ask. What was that moment like when you were asked to serve in this role? What was that experience? How does that even happen? What can you share with us? And you already talked about wanting to run away. That would have been my first reaction, but truly, what was that experience like for you?
What a positive endorsement that was for yourself there, Humberto.
I would say real positive experience. No, sorry. But yeah, what was that experience?
Yeah, so I know we're long, so I'll try to keep this brief because I'm still processing. So, so this is an answer that's unfolding. So you're just getting kind of the, raw in the moment. But for the most part, the end of last August, when it became clear that President Beasley's health was going to limit his ability to do the discernment process, and Scott Murphy and I needed to go to the Council of 12 and say, the presidency, Steve has asked us to turn this over to you. At that point, really for the next several months, all that Scott and I really focused on was the integrity of the process. And so my brain was, in my process mode of how do we create space? How do we give support to the 12? What do they need? All that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where my brain was. Then you fast forward and their final action, they went through all these different discerning phases, soliciting support from the church, et cetera, et cetera. They went into retreat, and then Scott and I had a meeting scheduled with the president of the 12, Mareva, and with the secretary, Richard James, at the end of that retreat so that they could sort of report out where they were. So we had a call scheduled. And then, we got an email from them and they said, hey, we're really ready to do this. And so instead of doing it like the next day, it was better for them if we did it on this Saturday night as they wrapped up. And so in my mind, it's like, okay, well, suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, we're going to hear like who it is. And this is going to, impact all of us as we lean into the future. And so, Mareva starts talking and, and I don't even know how to describe it to you, but just because of the nature of the words, because of this whole feeling, I was like, oh my gosh, I think she's going to say it's me, and it's like, anyways. And so it was this very overwhelming feeling.
Yeah.
And yet, so someone was like, well, were you surprised? Well, the answer is yes, very surprised, and no, not at all. So if you can imagine both of those feelings simultaneously, that's how it felt.
Yeah.
So she kind of said stuff. I don't even really remember what she said. They knew that I wasn't hearing at that point. And, they just said, we need to hear from you by then. And I was like, well, you'll hear from me probably before then. This was before Christmas. And so, my husband and I talked to the family, and my husband finally said, look, he's like, this is dumb. He goes, there is no scenario where you are going to say no. He said, there's 1,000 questions of insecurity and all, sense of overwhelmedness, all that kind of stuff. But there's no scenario where you're going to say no. So he's like, why don't you take the pressure off of the Council of 12 and, and tell them that you're going to say yes. And then you can go through all your struggles. So I got to them before, Christmas, so that they weren't holding their breath to see if they would need to go discern another person if I said no. So then later I was preaching early January, and I really hadn't stopped to even think about everything yet. And it was an online sermon. And at the end, there was a little bit of extra time. And so they asked me kind of the same question, although I hadn't really even thought about the question yet. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't really know. So, but what I came to understand, just even processing with them, is in retrospect, I can see where the Spirit was trying to prepare me for things, but I did not recognize that as I was moving through it. And it's, it's a lot, and I feel really unworthy. And I suspect that anybody that's ever said yes probably, feels that way. And I'm very humbled that not only the 12, but then when the call was presented to the joint council, that everyone supported the call. I still have this, imagination of getting to the 2025 World Conference and the conference laughing and saying, no, we're not going to approve her call. So that's those human, insecurities. And yet in a very humble way, when I went to work for the church, I basically said, here am I, God, use me in the way that you need me to be used. And so once you relinquish yourself to that sense of response, then if this is the call that comes, I trust the calling process. I trust in the Council of 12, and I ultimately trust in the wisdom of the World Conference. And if they approve the call, then with humble gratitude, I will pour my life into doing the very best that I'm able to do.
So our last question for you today is a bit lighter. What are some of the lessons you've learned about international travel? Is there a place in the church you're looking forward to visit? Are there certain things that have happened in your travels around going to congregations that are just, you can't believe that happened? What in the world?
Yeah, so what I know is that if you're traveling internationally, you really do want global entry. So, global entry is like the best thing ever, and I don't know why I ever traveled without it. Two, it's really important that you check the status of your immunizations more than just a few days before you travel, because a lot of them takes, like months of series of shots or whatever, to do. So that is like really important and really horrible. That malaria pills, because you do malaria prophylactic, you just take the pills in case you get it. They really do make you have the craziest dreams ever. So that's like the closest I've ever come to taking hallucinogens. And I mean, the wildest, craziest possible dreams. Turns out that the US is the only place that has decaf coffee. No, Canada, some of the Western places, but mostly decaf coffee is a US thing. So traveling with decaf coffee, if you are a coffee person and don't want to do tons of caffeine, is really important. Always having Kleenex or some form of paper tissue at hand wherever you are is always, always important. And I love hand sanitizer. I mean, it's like better than perfume when you're traveling. So the best kind of hand sanitizer, Mareva gave me some recently when I was in French Polynesia, that has like, it's kind of like, it's got like a natural smell to it or whatever. It doesn't smell like all, like
It's like Bath and Body
sanitary.
Works-esque type.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's like the best, because then, you go through like a reception line, and then you can just like kind of smack it
Yeah.
on your face, on your neck, on your arms, and then, you're all fresh
You
again.
don't
So
you don't smell like you fell into like a moonshine jar or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So those
Yep.
are like some of the practical things. But what I will say is that the love and acceptance of Community of Christ members is worldwide. And although there are 1,000 different ways to worship, a whole bunch of different language, there is a recognizable feel and community to Community of Christ experiences in all the places that I've been. And I have been just privileged and humbled by every gathering that I've ever attended. I'm not well traveled in Asia, so that would certainly be one of the areas. I'm also not well traveled in South America. So there are a couple of places, in the world where I look forward to opportunities to gather, with our people. But and I'm a strong proponent that we really need to create partnerships that allow people to experience each other's cultures. And so that means not always bringing people to like the US, but taking people to other places, not to do mission, but to experience the church and create relationships. So I think it was 2010, International Youth Forum got canceled. So myself and Greg McDonald ended up, there were 10 youth from the United States who had already purchased plane tickets to go to Africa. So we ended up taking that group of 10 high school students to several countries in Africa. It was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. And I think we should be creating those opportunities. So that's on my wish list for others to make happen. I want to be able to be Captain Picard and just say, make it so.
Yeah. What was the equivalent of the Peace Corps we had? The service? It was
World Service Corps.
World Service Corps. Yeah.
Almost like a micro version of that, where you get to experience community.
Yeah,
Okay.
Absolutely.
I just we need to address something very, very quickly. Stacy, are you a Star Trek fan?
I love Star Trek.
Already got my vote. I mean, you already had my vote, but I mean, also, I love it. Oh my gosh, yes. Voyager is my favorite. We talk about Voyager too much, but I was raised with Next Generation, as everyone should be. So yeah, sorry, I'm
How
nerding
can
out
you
here.
not love a series that in the 1960s had a Black female communication officer? I mean, my hero.
Exactly. First interracial kiss ever in U.S. television history, in general. Oh, sorry. We're devolving. I apologize. Thank you so much. For
I don't
taking
have a
some
nerd
time
button.
out of
I
your
would have
night.
hit it real quick.
Listen.
I looked. I didn't have anything on here.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Anyways, thank you so much for being with us, answering our questions and the questions of this audience. Dear listeners, if you have more questions that you have for Jacob and I, or for Stassi, you can also reach out to her on her email. That's included at cfchrist.org, and I know that she would love your questions and comments. But also, if you'd like questions to us, you can answer our question form at ministryfordummies.org, and we'd love to hear it. But with that, Jacob, take us to the outro.
Once again, thank you, Stassi, for joining us here today, and thank you to all 4 or 5 of our listeners for joining us. This podcast
and thanks for having me. I do need to say that, so thanks for letting me be here.
Of course, we're so thankful that you joined us. This podcast is made possible by listeners and disciples of Christ, and by the members of the community of Christ. Without you, we would not be here. If you have any ideas or questions about the podcast, as Humberto said, please go to our website, ministryfordummies.org, and fill out our questions or comments form there. We look forward to seeing you, and thank you for following along with us today.